sound. Yeah, sorry. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to introduce Richard Stern from Carnegie Mellon, where he's a professor of electrical engineering. He got his undergraduate and, well, first degree, I guess SB.
SB, yes.
SB at MIT, and then he went to Berkeley, and then he returned to MIT, and you have an SCD. You have a PhD. I see, and he's got a PhD from MIT, and from then on,
I've been at Carnegie Mellon.
I'm the Carnegie Mellon, and he's a concert harpsichordist. Okay, well, I don't know what he's going to do now.
Okay. What I'm going to do now, Fred, is thank you for having invited me, and thank you all for coming. This is actually a very nice turnout. It's a wonderful series. I have spoken on the series before when it was at Rutgers, and I've been at Johns Hopkins on various times, but never in this capacity, and it really is a pleasure to be here. As you know, I'll be talking about, well, new directions in robust speech recognition. And all of those people up there are all former or present students, and they're all people whose data or audio clips, at least, I'm citing. So that's why they're there. And John, if you're not there, it's only because I'm not including your audio today. I'm sorry. And before we begin, I want to put in a commercial plug. How many of you spent up Thursday night writing Eurospeech abstracts and wondering how you're ever going to get to Portugal? Well, I have excellent news for you. Because the next interspeech meeting is the ICSP 2006, which is going to be in Pittsburgh. In fact, I can tell you right where it is. It's going to be right behind that building, in that one.
Why is that good news?
Pittsburgh, it's good news because Pittsburgh is a wonderful city to visit. It's 4.5 hours easy by car. I wouldn't even attempt to drive to Lisbon. But, we're going to put on a great meeting for you. And the room rate is going to be inexpensive. The registration fee is going to be inexpensive. We'll have excellent speakers. And I really hope to see all of you in Pittsburgh. Consider that you've been invited by the general chair. And that's an invitation that you cannot refuse. It's going to be a very good meeting. And I really, really, really look forward to having a wonderful, good presence from Johns Hopkins there. This is going to be a great meeting to go to. And
this picture is from a hill where you can actually go and get this view.
That's right, that's right. You don't have to be in an airplane. Yeah, this is right up the Duquesne Incline. Okay, so I'm here to talk today about robust speech recognition and what kind of things we can do to improve recognition accuracy for it. And one of the measures of success is how the problem has really evolved over the years. Of course, the reason for doing this is as speech recognition is transferred from the laboratory to the marketplace, robustness is increasingly important. There's a long history of interesting ideas that have failed as products because they don't meet the practical demands of what's needed. And back when I started doing this work, which was rounded to the nearest 5 years, about 1985 or so, a difficult task for robust recognition would simply be recognizing speech in a quiet room just using a desktop microphone rather than a headset-mounted microphone. In fact, we used the Crown PZM6FS because that's what IBM used. That was when Fred was there. Nowadays, when we're talking about robust recognition, and the first problem is pretty much, I wouldn't say completely solved, but resolved to the point of being boring. Nowadays, when we talk about robust recognition, I'm talking more about something like speech recognition over a cell phone in a car with the windows down and the radio playing at highway speeds. And that is a much more difficult problem for a lot of reasons. So let's take a look at some examples of what I consider to be some of the difficult problems in speech recognition. And these are all real pieces of audio that have a real motivation behind them, be them an application or an evaluation. This is speech that I personally recorded about 50 feet away from F-18s taxiing down a runway. And this is at the Pax River base in August of 2001. And which is a good thing we went in August because we would not have been able to go in October. But 12, the God of heaven forgive me. Now, 11, you divert me against my conscience. That's recorded over the best noise-canceling microphone that the Navy has in their arsenal of acoustical weapons. And nevertheless, you still get a huge amount of noise poking through. And to make matters worse, it's very focused in a very narrow spectral band, which makes classical techniques like adaptive noise cancellation very difficult to implement. LMS doesn't work when you have a wide eigenvalue spread. Speech and background music is surprisingly difficult, as you'll hear me talk about later. This is in Spanish, but you'll get the idea.
La visión del mundo desde Hispanoamérica para todos quienes hablamos español. Por nuestra parte ha sido todo, Verónica, muchas gracias. Muchas gracias a usted por su atención y compañía, y hasta la próxima.
The average news show can't go for more than about 20 seconds without juicing the audio with some kind of, or teletypes in the background or something. It's not only in Telemundo, it's also CNN as well. You listen, you'll hear. Speech and background speech is also really a tough problem. And that's an issue not only in conversational speech, but also in commercial broadcast sources.
En el Capitolio los republicanos dijeron que es un presupuesto para los jóvenes.
Give these young people a chance to go on to school, to have a better education.
Les damos.
This is interesting, of course, because it's not only simultaneous speech, but also multilingual speech. The first language, in case you didn't notice, was Spanish, and the second was English. Transient dropouts in noise, if I can find the cursor here, is... This kind of thing happens, you know, the audio just drops out. And that, you know, is an issue. This actually is direct from the spine task, by the way, Astrid. We have you to thank for that piece of sound. Another one is spontaneous speech.
Where did you grow up?
Got that? Where did you grow up? Yeah. Very tough for machines, even translating it. Another one that some of you might not have thought about a lot, but is really one of the most difficult problems nowadays is reverberated speech. Ah, jeez.
P-I-T-T-S-B-U-R-G-H.
Sorry, they're not all at the same levels. And also finally, speech going through vocoding.
My reveries were shattered by a loud crash.
This was a famous demo that Rich Cox at AT&T put together. This was speech going through 2400 baud LPC-10, which was the standard for the agency for a while. Now, there's some obvious things that all of you know. As signal-to-noise ratio goes down, recognition accuracy goes down. So what we're looking at, the white curve there, is recognition accuracy of a standard recognizer, one of ours. I don't remember exactly which one. It's great if I stand in front. If I could stand right here, I can liberate everything, right? Over here, as the SNR goes down, the recognition accuracy goes down. The yellow curve gives you the curve that we get if you actually train the system at a particular signal-to-noise ratio, which is not really kosher most of the time, but even that will start going down because at some point you get noise in the signal. And oh, does it work? Oh, it's one of those pointers. I know, I'm giving it to you. Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is great. The problem with these things for me is I get it looks like I have Parkinson's when I use them. Good hands, but I'll try. So, yeah, that's right.
From medical school. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And here's speech recognition accuracy in reverberant rooms. And what we're looking at is listening to some audio.
P-I-T-T-S-B-U-R-G-H.
CMU alums in the room will recognize this as Tom Sullivan. As we increase the reverberation time, and this was done by measuring actual impulse rooms of impulse responses, ATR did this, at rooms of different wetness and then artificially convolving, so it's not...
P-I-T-T-S-B-U-R-G-H.
At 300, we get a pretty good word error rate, but as we go from 300 to 470,
P-I-T-T-S-B-U-R-G-H.
you can see the recognition accuracy gets a lot worse. It's a little confusing because it's word error rate going up and the other one was word error rate going down, but if you look carefully, it'll go. And the largest one was, I think, what you heard before.
P-I-T-T-S-B-U-R-G-H.
It was sort of interesting to me. There. It was sort of interesting to me that this gets worse at about the reverb time at which you can actually start perceptually hearing, which you can start hearing the effects of the reverberation. And in fact, most of the things that I run around, run around town talking about are completely ineffective for that kind of reverberation. I'll talk about one thing that works a little, but it doesn't. But reverberation is still a big unsolved problem. So when I talk about challenges in robust recognition, I have my own internal taxonomy. On the one hand, there are what I refer to as classical problems, things like quasi-stationary additive noise, or quasi-stationary linear filtering. And by quasi-stationary, I mean stationary over about a second or so. It's about an average, resource management sentence, a second or two. It's not super long, but it's still pretty long. And those are problems that, as you'll see, we can do a pretty good job on, although there's still some room for improvement. We can still do a pretty good job on, and they're good enough so that they're not interesting as interesting as they were, say, 10 or 15 years ago. Modern problems are things that we're dealing with right now to varying degree of effectiveness. Things like transient degradations, burst noise, much lower SNR always is going to be important. And then we have what I call difficult problems, and I mean difficult in the sense that the Japanese use the word difficult. If you ask to do something, they say, this will be very difficult. What it means is it's damn near impossible, and they don't really want to do it, but they're too polite to tell you that you can't get it done easily. So these are difficult problems. I hope it's not that impossible, but it's still hard. And that includes things like highly spontaneous speech masked by other speech, and speech masked by music. And we'll, again, revisit why those are hard and maybe some of the things that we can do to help things out as we move along. By the way, please do interrupt me anytime, but try not to interrupt too much so I can get everything in. But if you do interrupt a lot, I'll simply cut stuff up, but that's okay. So, but please do feel free to ask questions at any time. Anyway, one model that really served us well for a pretty long period of time, and this is the work of Alex Otero, Fuhar Lu, Pedro Moreno, and others, was first developed by us in the late 80s in Alex's thesis. So one thing that's fairly prosaic but quite useful is a model for degraded speech is simply you take clean speech and pass it through an unknown linear filter and then subject it to unknown additive noise, and that gives you something that you can use as a placeholder for degraded speech. And so for a long time what we were trying to do was simply use whatever statistical estimation procedures we could bring to bear to try to estimate the impulse response to the filters and estimate the spectral density function or something like that of the noise. And then if we could do that, then we could apply the appropriate inverse transformations that would give us an approximation to the clean speech. It would train up a system on clean speech, and we do pretty well. That's an interesting problem. It's a non-trivial problem because if you're working in the Kepstral domain, which is where our features are, the effects of additive noise are additive in the regular spectral domain. And the effects of linear filtering, which is convolutional distortion, are additive in the log spectral or Kepstral domain. So the combination of the two inevitably is going to be nonlinear in nature, and hence you're always going to have to use some either some kind of approximation or an iterative solution in order to get the right estimates. So here's some examples of how well we can do, again as a function of signal-to-noise ratio. Up is good, down is bad on this graph. I know it's not 100% consistent. So here's the original Kepstral mean normalization, which is kind of the baseline. Here's the how far we get with complete retraining. And the red curve here is Alex Othero's CDCN algorithm. That stands for code word dependent Kepstral normalization. The green curve is Pedro Moreno and Biksha Raj's vector Taylor series, VTS. That was there is another algorithm. Any of you who know Jacobian transformations provided by Sagayama is basically the same thing. Sagayama is a friend of mine, but the fact remains that they did it after we did, and they still don't talk about our work when they talk about their work, which irks us. So VTS came out first. Anyway, the way I want you to read this is you have this curve here and you have this curve here, and to my mind, what is important is the shift in the threshold. So the way I look at this is going from here to here, we move the curve over by about 7 dB. And 7 dB doesn't sound like a very big number. It's less than 10, a lot less than 100. But if you're sitting at around 5 to 10 dB, it's the difference between not being able to do anything at all down here to being able to do almost as well as you could have possibly done if you were completely retrained on that particular system. So that's a pretty good improvement. Of course, what we'd like to do is be able to extend that threshold further, and the extent to which we're successful can be judged by the extent to which we do this further. I thought I'd play, it's a little amusing and not completely accurate. Lately I've been experimenting a little bit with trying to recover the signal from the transformed Kepler coefficients just to kind of hear what happens when you do these things. So here, for example, is a clean speech utterance.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
Sure, all of you are familiar with that one. That's the dialect normalization sentence from Timid, right? And this is in nominally 13 dB, and once again, I can't find there it is.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
And taking the Kepler coefficients as converted by the VTS algorithm, I think, and then trying to reconstruct the audio from it. And this is not perfect. I think there are artifacts in it, so don't take this for anything beyond what it is.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
I believe the glitches that you hear are a consequence of phase artifacts, which I'm trying to get rid of, and not a fundamental limitation. But the difference is, and that certainly is not more intelligible than the other one, but it certainly is less noisy.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
Here's the same thing. Yes, Zach?
Did you add pitch from the original?
We excited it with the original noisy error. We did an LPC analysis, and we excited it with the error function. So, you know, that also might be an issue too. I didn't know what else to do. I could try just doing whispered speech and see if that sounds any better, but it was just, you know the way it is, a summer project for an undergraduate, and then they took off for vacation for 2 weeks right before when I thought they'd get the real work done. And I haven't had a chance to get back to it, I guess because it's not next summer yet.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
And this is the recovered version, which sounds even worse.
She had your dark suit in greasy wash water all year.
So you can take that for what it is. Again, I think it's not quite right, but the fact is that we do better, you know, whatever it is that it works from is from those Kepler coefficients. And we do actually get a tangible improvement in recognition accuracy, even though it might sound wretched to the likes of us. But more on that later. Now, one big take-home message, though, is that even though we get good improvement here, the flip side of that is that we don't get that for all kinds of disturbances. So here, the green curve here is the percentage improvement in the percentage decrease in word error rate that we get when we apply, in this case, I think it was CDCN, to something coming in. And VTS for this would work almost as well as a function of SNR. Now, you'd expect this curve to pinch off to basically 0 for very high SNRs, because at high SNRs there's no degradation and hence no improvement. And at very low SNRs, because at very low SNRs you can't do anything at all, regardless of whether you compensate or not. But in the middle, there's that nice big fat spot that we saw before, where there's about that 40% decrease in word error rate, somewhere between 10 and 20.
40% from the lousy error rate.
Yeah, you take the lousy error rate, you subtract 40% from that, and you get the cleaned up error rate.
Right.
You know.
Mean you're well off.
Oh no. This is percent decrease. In general, for most of the stuff that I do, I pay attention to percentage improvement in error rate, because that's a measure that's more task independent and more recognition engine independent than many other things that we do. I'm not so concerned with the absolute increase or decrease. I'm just trying to get it to work better. And it seems to be about equally difficult to make it work, say, 20% better than it was before, independent of task and independent of baseline accuracy, to a degree. Now, that was white noise, which is typically the easiest kind of noise to deal with in this context. With Hub 4 music, the red curve, the story is that basically nothing works very well at all. And music is a big bugaboo. You can ask, why is music so tough? Well, there are a couple of obvious things we can point to. One of them is that, particularly for vocal music, it's easy for the music to get confused with the speech that you want to pay attention to. But also, just in general, the nature of the music is that it's constantly changing. And those algorithms that I talked about before are based on sniffing out the statistics of what you have and trying to convert them to something that looks like clean speech. And if the background keeps changing statistically from out from under you, then you just can't get very good estimates. So things that work well in quasi-stationary environments don't work well in changing environments. And changing acoustical environments are, one of the several difficult problems that we have to contend with. And you can certainly see that in the data. So again, hard problems for speech recognition include low signal-to-noise ratios, transient disturbances, co-channel speech and music, reverberant environments. A couple that I'm not going to say much about today include spontaneous speech, encoded speech, and telephone channels. So we'll have to leave that for when you invite me to come back again, and hopefully I'll have something to tell you by then. But I'll focus on the first four problems, which is enough for today, anyhow. And so how do we solve these problems? Well, one thing we can do is speech recognition using missing features. Another is using combination of parallel information streams, including multiband analysis. And you heard or well, at least a few of you, heard Katrin Kirchhoff talk this morning about several interesting topics, and one of them, in fact, was the improvement that you get with combination of information across different knowledge sources. Also, microphone array processing provides the opportunity to improve recognition accuracy in situations where there's a spatial component to what's out there. Physiologically motivated feature extraction is something that's been kind of a pet goal of the speech research community for decades. But we now, I think for the first time, are at a point where we have the computational resources to support interesting experiments and hopefully some useful advances. And finally, processing based on auditory scene analysis may, and again, I have to say may rather than does, provide an opportunity for us to use extrinsic cues, again, perhaps in the way that the brain may or may not use, that enable us to separate complex sources when they're presented simultaneously. And ultimately, probably a combination of all of those things will provide the answer. Again, a couple of things that I won't be talking about today are time normalization. John Nettle, my former student, did some excellent work on that over the last couple of years. And also for telephone channels and coding, modeling, the effects of speech coding, and performing recognition directly based on coded parameters is also useful. So these first topics in yellow are the ones that I'll be talking about today. There is 50, 20, 35 minutes left. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's an average of 7 minutes per topic. And we'll see what we can do. In any case, we may not get them all in, but that's okay. You can ask questions about the ones that I don't do. So first, let's talk about missing feature recognition. This is certainly not something that we invented at Carnegie Mellon. Missing feature recognition was a part of visual scene analysis. The group at the University of Sheffield, notably Martin Cook in his very important PhD thesis, laid out how this work can be, this approach can be applied to speech recognition. But the general idea is you take a display of information like a spectrogram. It doesn't have to be a spectrogram, but something like a spectrogram in which you might have a time frequency plot, and try to determine which cells in that display are likely to be unreliable, or as they would say, missing. Then once you've made that determination, if you've done it reasonably accurately, then you can either just try to make the recognition based on the good ones that are present, or try to make your best guess about the values that those things, the missing ones had based on in other words, fill in the missing data based on what you know about the statistics of the signal you're looking at and the values of the ones that are present, and then go from there. In our work on this, we do the latter. And the other thing that we do differently from the Sheffield group, and it's not only Sheffield, by the way, that's done this. This is done around the world. Rich Lippman, actually, at Lincoln Lab, did a lot of the original work, as well as the Sheffield group. But we modify incoming features rather than the internal models. And we do that because once we do that, then we can just take any garden variety speech recognition system and work on the output rather than having to physically tailor the speech recognition system to the features that are present or absent. In general, a lot of speaker adaptation problems and a lot of environment adaptation problems, perhaps, as these might be, are typically situations which you have data coming in here, you have statistical models here, and they're somehow different. And you can either make the data look more like the models, or you can make the models look more like the data. And typically, if you work on the model side, In other words, if you manipulate the internal models, you'll get a better recognition accuracy because you can work with the covariance matrices in addition to the mean values. And that generally is better, but it's more complicated. If you work on the incoming data, you're typically only working towards causing the average of the data to look like the average of the training data. And it's more limited in accuracy, but on the other hand, it's simpler. Nevertheless,
What features are missing, for instance?
well, typically in our work, we look at log spectral values. So we have a display. I'll show you in a second, actually with some real data. I guess we actually work on log spectral features and fill them in and then convert them to Kepler coefficients. If you work on the inside, you have to just do all the work on log spectral features and then recognize on log spectral features. And Kepler coefficients are better. They're not optimal. So let's try to answer Fred's question more directly. Here's an example of a speech spectrogram that happens to be me saying, welcome to DSP1. This is what the spectrogram looks like corrupted to noise at 15 dB SNR, this energy.
Put back the origin, please.
Say it again?
Put back the origin.
Yeah.
Yes, I see.
So if you look at the two, you flash them together, you can see that the information, if you imagine this as, say, a contour map, the peaks are preserved and the valleys are kind of filled in. And that's totally unsurprising. That's exactly what you would expect noise would do, where there's particularly white noise. Now, the next thing we can do is we can mark those regions in the spectrogram that are corrupted by the noise. So again, comparing this with the previous curve, well, all that I did is I took the things that were below a certain point and colored them dark blue and said, this is what we're not going to use. Now, I can look at these things. One week back in 1985, I took Victor Zhu's spectrogram reading course. And for about a week, I could decode these things. It didn't last very long. Under those circumstances, that's enough information to understand things. But getting a pattern classifier to do that is, more difficult. But again, if you can identify the things that are bad, you can then use your a priori statistics of what the speech signal should look like in that space, and then use that to fill in what you have. And here's some results that we have. This is from Bhiksha Raj's PhD thesis. This is speech corrupted by white noise. And I want to point out that these curves were done assuming perfect knowledge of which features were corrupted. And that's a big issue. Here we have baseline recognition accuracy. In this curve, it's accuracy. So up is good, down is bad. And spectral subtraction, which is about what conventional algorithms like CD-SAN or VTS would give us, gives you about this much of a shift. And it's sort of about the same, more or less 7 dB shift that we saw before for white noise in the background. But then two different missing feature algorithms. I'm not going to go to the details. You can ask me about them if you want, or you can read his thesis, which is available on my group's website. You get the URL at the end of the talk if you say that long. But the bottom line is that if we can identify everything accurately, this is great. We get a big shift. I don't know what this comes to, but it looks like it's about a 15 dB shift. Of course, doing this perfectly well is a big if, but it shows that there's a great potential to be had if we can make that determination accurately. Here's the same thing corrupted by music. Note that in this case here, the spectral subtraction is no better than the baseline, and that's consistent with what I asserted before. And again, we do better and actually pretty decently, although not quite as good, with the speech corrupted by music using the missing features. Now, once again, those are results obtained with the totally unrealistic expectation that we can identify with 100% accuracy where the good pixels are and where the bad pixels are. Now, let's take a look at some real data. This was part of Mike Seltzer's master's thesis. Mike is now at actually Microsoft working with Alex Otero. He's one of my second generation students working for other students of mine, which is nice to see. This curve, and there are going to be a couple like it, this is with white noise in the background. Baseline is here. Energy-based masks, which is similar to what we saw before with spectral subtraction, gets you about to here. The red curve are oracle masks. Those are masks done, again, with perfect knowledge. And using a Bayesian classifier with features that are, the most effective features were for voice speech And we did a blind pitch detection and looked at the energy in the harmonic frequencies versus the energy in the other frequencies, and that gave us, then there were some other ad hoc things. His master's thesis is on my website too, and there's some papers about this. But we do pretty well, I'd say. We don't do quite as well on, as you would imagine, as we did, as if you had perfect knowledge, but we do a lot better than with energy masks, and we're pretty close to the top. Here's another example with factory noise. This is, again, baseline energy mask, a little bit better. This is about, with the Bayesian mask, about 50% to the level that we get with the Oracle mask. Zach?
So these noises are added artificially, they are not...
The noises are added artificially, yes, and big caveat. And so it's not, that's the only way that we can get the Oracle numbers, though.
Sure. I was just thinking about the Lombard effect.
No, that's won't do anything for Lombard. Fortunately, in my experience, Lombard doesn't kick in until you start losing recognition accuracy at much higher SNRs than you get Lombard. By the time you get significant Lombard effect, you're already gone in terms of speech, unless you're using a closed talking microphone, in which case it could be an issue. This is the curve for music. Here, interestingly enough, at least in this situation, this is baseline here. Spectral subtraction kind of masks are worse than baseline. And again, the Oracle masks are up here quite good, and the Bayesian masks are not nearly as good. They're about a third the way. Most of the difficulty is in problems having to do with estimating unvoiced segments. And if anybody wants to pick up on this work and run with it, I'd love to have it continued. It doesn't have to be in Pittsburgh. And there's certainly a lot more room for improvement. But we're doing better than we were before, and we do get, again, looking at this, about a 4 dB improvement in threshold. I'd say it's about a 4 dB shift, where we're getting minus 0.5 dB or something like that before. So again, on a very difficult problem. So that's, again, I believe that missing features are interesting and a good way to go. The task has shifted from trying to do something with the missing features to finding out which features are missing. And to some degree, that's a more constrained problem. But still, there's a lot more work to be done in there. Now, the other counterpart solution, and this has been trumpeted by Hervé Ballard, Hinek Hermansky, Nelson Morgan and their cohorts at ICSI and IDIAP, originally was called the multiband approach. And they did it here too. They did it here at the workshop. They started it here. Born here. A product of Johns Hopkins. The basic idea, following observations of Harvey Fletcher, as reiterated without cease by John Allen, the auditory system is known to process speech separately in separate frequency bands. And the original motivation was to construct different recognizers that were tuned to each frequency band, and then to do the best job you can, and then somehow combine the information somehow from the various frequency bands. There are some implementation issues, how many bands, what level to split and merge, and how to combine, so forth and so on. But that's the general idea. I'm not going to talk directly, at least, well, for a moment. I will say this for a moment. Missing features versus multiband. My take on this is that Ballard et al. Now have a method called the full combination method. And what that means is that if you have a reasonably small number of bands, somewhere between 5 and 10 perhaps, it's actually computationally feasible rather, to try every permutation of the bands within a reasonable period of time. Look at the a posterior probability for a given duration utterance that you get, and then simply choose the combination of good bands and bad bands that gives you greatest a posteriori probability. And that gives you a pretty good crack at making sure that you have the best possible choice of bands. So what this means, though, is that you can imagine taking something like a spectrogram, and in the original incarnation, you're taking the spectrogram and partitioning it into n, where n is like 5 to 15 horizontal bands. And that's the partitioning of the observation space that you're doing. Now, on the other hand, if we look at the missing features, what we're doing now is we're taking every single pixel in the spectrogram as its own isolated point. And so You can basically pick this pixel and take it, and not pick the next pixel and take that. So what happens is in the full combination method, you get the best combination of bands, but the hit that you take is kind of in the quantization, that you've taken a very crude partitioning of the observation space. When you have missing features, I guess they're down here, when you have missing features, you have a much finer partitioning of the observation space. You can choose or not choose every pixel as you wish, but you take a hit there because because you're not going to get the partitioning done perfectly. So you can name your poison, but I believe that as we get better and better, missing feature approach is going to prevail. Of course, as we get faster and faster, then you can do multi-band combination with more and more bands. I'm not spending a lot of time on multi-band analysis, partly because we don't do it, so I don't have our own data to show, but also because I prefer to view multi-band analysis as a special case of information fusion. The bands don't have to be frequency by frequency band. A lot of the more recent work of that group has been what they call tandem combination of taking two different, qualitatively different kinds of recognition systems and kind of putting the information together. And also the combination of information can take place at various levels in a speech recognition system. Information fusion is presently a highly active area of research. We do it, Katrin Kirchhoff does it, and lots of other people do it. If you look at programs in the interspeech meetings, there are sessions that are involved in this stuff, just like 15 years ago there used to be multiple sessions on spectral subtraction. This is one thing that's active right now because you can do it. So let's take a look at some of the various things you can do. Combination of information streams. Here's a metaphor for 3 independent recognition systems. And this is nominally the feature extraction level. This is where you do the actual decoding state by state, and then or this is where the probabilities are computed. And then you have to do some HMM work that kind of runs you through the probabilities and comes up with the best hypothesis, and that gives you 3 different outputs. One thing that we can do, feature combination, is to combine information at the level of the feature extraction. So the fairly prosaic techniques of linear discriminant analysis, principal component analysis, or just plain concatenating the features, those are all examples of things you can do with feature combination. And a second area is state combination. Typically, the way this is realized is that you compute your probabilities at each of the recognizers separately. You have to be kind of cycling through the network of possible states in a parallel fashion, at least in the easiest implementation. And then you combine the probabilities. You could add them together, you can multiply them together, you can take the maximum. Those are the 3 rules. The work that Katrin Kirchhoff talked about this morning were typically state combination using multiplicative combination. At least that's what I picked up from her description. The other thing you can do is you can combine with the outputs. You can take the outputs and combine them somehow. The NIST rover routine was the original incarnation of this, and there are a lot of smarter things that you can do besides rover. So, for example, here's an example of output combination. This is Rita Singh's hypothesis combination algorithm, and you have from 2 different recognizers. This was from the spine task, south, southwest confirmed, and fire southwest. And you identify places from the 2 recognition hypotheses. The white numbers correspond to beginning and ends, beginnings of word hypotheses, and the blue numbers represent scores in log probability measure. So you'll find something here where you have 2 words that begin and end at the same point from the 2 parallel hypothesizers, and then combine the probability. So you do this by converting back to probability, adding the probability together, then converting back to log probability. So you get that number. And this means now that you have a network, you can go this way, or you can go that way, and now you can look for the best path through this combined network. And this was a technique that we used with good success on the Spine 2000 evaluation. You'll remember that. Here, for example, we had 3 recognizers in parallel. The first one used Mel frequency capsule coefficients. The second, PLP, perceptual linear prediction coefficients. This one is actually a variant on Mel frequency coefficients. And I don't know if you can see it. It's kind of tiny. And the top word error rate is 35.1. The next one is 38, and the last one is 47.4. But if you put them together, you get 32.8%, which is a word error rate which is lower than the lowest of the original ones. So by combining parallel hypotheses derived from complementary feature sets, we can get dramatically lower error rate. In fact, we ended up with 28% error rate, but that was using other stuff beyond just what I'm talking about here. Here's another example of an application of that. This is using different kinds of compensation. Filtered MFCC gives you something here. PLP. Actually, I meant to delete this slide, I thought, and keep the next one. I think I did the reverse. Let me see if it's gone. There we go. Forget about the last one. It's redundant. But this is different compensation schemes. No compensation, Carhinen-Low F transformation, singular value decomposition, vector Taylor series, CDCN. Each of them has a, the best of any of them individually is about 31%. Putting them all together gets you down to about 29%, which is an improvement of about 7 or 8%. It's kind of free if you have all the extra things. These are all done. The interesting thing is we get these improvements from representations that are very similar to one another. I think that if we can somehow come up with a good systematic way of finding features that are maximally complementary to each other, we're looking for ways in which we have a second set of features that give us information that's completely different from the first set. Remember, we're getting these advantages with Mel-frequency Kepler coefficients and PLP, and they're really, those are both energy-based features. They're slightly different, but there's nothing dramatically different between the two. What we're trying to do, at least in part, is come up with ways of not only finding better ways to combine things, but also to find better ways of choosing features that will be maximally different from one another, so that when we do that combination, we're getting new information. Okay, this is a more systematic investigation from Shang Li, recently graduated from my lab. Now he's working for Juan Huerta, who at IBM, older former student. And this compares recognition results that we get looking at the 3 different levels. Here are 2 systems with PLP and MFCC coefficients. PLP never worked for us as well as MFCCs, which is why we don't use it routinely. But when you combine them, feature combination using Mel-frequency Kepler coefficient, just looking at the yellow box for now, or principal component analysis, we get results that again are better. These are 2 feature combination methods. We can apply output combination. This is hypothesis combination as described previously. A more heroic implementation of that that's much, much, much slower, does a little bit better. And finally, if we, instead of doing the hypothesis combination, we do state combination, we do even better than that. Now, the red curves are curves using the same methods, but done using features that were optimally transformed to be a little bit more different from one another than before. And again, each of these by themselves doesn't give you a very big kick in the butt. But if we look at the original result using Mel-frequency Kepler coefficients, it's a little worse than 10%. And the best result using transformed features is 5.7%. So we've really achieved about a 40 to 50% relative improvement in recognition accuracy. Now, I do have to say that this is for resource management. As we get to larger tasks, the percentage improvement diminishes somewhat. But again, by combining these things, we can get substantial improvements. Of the 3 levels, it appears that state combination is the most effective. And I think for that reason, that's why you see Katrin doing that, and Hervé and Hynek as well. It's relatively computationally inexpensive. And I suspect that as time goes by, that's the kind of combination that will seem to dominate the scene. By the way, you see this in audiovisual fusion as well. And people in that field tend to refer to this as early combination, middle combination, and late combination. But the techniques are basically the same. Okay, no questions? No questions. All right. Microphone arrays. We have a bunch of microphones. They can provide a directional response, accepting speech from some directions and suppressing others. This is just the beam pattern at a single frequency of a delay in some beamformer. So, ideally you can get the speaker here and not the one there. The other thing, again, with regard to the room reverberation problem, certainly, particularly if you're in the back of the room, if you close one ear and listen to me as I continue to speak, you should hear the speech intelligibility go down substantially. And does it work? Yeah, it does. And that's because what you're hearing, of course, as you're listening to my speech, you get the direct signal, and then the reflected signal bounced off the walls and the ceilings. And there's a mechanism in binaural processing that suppresses the latter arriving arrivals. This is called the precedence effect, or the law of the first wavefront, or the Haas effect, depending on which paper you read and what the actual circumstances are. And the auditory system is able to do this somehow. And what it does is it shuts down the response to the components that are arriving in different directions. Now, I've never been very good at emulating that, even though there are some computational models out there that, that seem to try to describe that mechanism. But one of the other ways that you can get a similar effect is simply having a directionally focused response, because if you have a beam pattern that focuses on just the direct field, it will reduce the intensity associated with the fields coming from the side, and that nominally should give you some improvement in recognition accuracy. Now, there's a lot of work that's been done in array processing, much of which doesn't work in reverberant environments. I'm not going to go through this list to save time, but the thing that's important here is that the objective of most of these traditional methods was to come up with a configuration of arrays. And typically with microphone arrays, you have a bunch of different microphones, and then they go through some kind of filtering. And the object of the filtering is to equalize what comes into the various channels, and then you then they go in. If it's adaptive, what the adaptation algorithm manipulates is typically the taps on the filters, which more often than not are FIR filters. In any case, the objective of all those adaptation algorithms is inevitably to reduce signal distortion, which may or may not give you error rate. So in recent work done by another student, Mike Seltzer, he's the same guy who did the work on missing features with not doing the estimation blind. That was his master's thesis, his PhD thesis. And what I'm saying here is the traditional array processing is done. You have the microphone array, you have the array processor. This is the waveform here. You try to, what the traditional array processing algorithms do is they try to minimize the distortion at this point. Then you go through feature extraction and speech recognition.
Minimize the distortion with respect to what?
Typical mean square error. You take the clean signal or some estimate of it, and then you take the signal that comes out of the microphone, and then you try to have that. Typically, you don't have access to the clean signal, of course.
Exactly.
But so you try to set up a situation where if you do it perfectly, the signal gets canceled. And then what you minimize is what comes out, which is presumed to be an error signal. And if you have the right spatial configuration, then you can get that to happen. The algorithms are cute, and they work well, but not for this application. So what Seltzer did is, instead of trying to minimize the distortion here, what he did instead was manipulate the array processing so as to minimize the distortion of the features that came out. So instead of working with the waveform space as the objective function, you work with the feature space. And this gives you a processing, and again, the thesis is, actually there's a paper in the SAP Transactions that came out recently that described it. He calls it Lima beam. I wanted a more prosaic name, but in this situation, the students always win. Here's some examples of signals. This is speech in a room.
22163.
This is, anybody who's been to CMU, this is Porter Hall B34, in the conference room near my office, with the radio playing, and it was before the redecoration, might be a little bit less reverberant now.
22163.
This is what you get with delay and some beamforming, which is the typical baseline configuration.
22163.
It's a little better, not a lot better. This is the Seltzer compensation with the same inputs, so it's the same signals that you heard in the previous example.
22163.
It suppresses a lot of the low frequencies, and in fact, I listened to this last night with headphones on, and there's a big AC hum coming out that you can't hear at all in this environment. But I'll play this one more time.
22163. 22163. 22163.
And if you train the system to recognize that kind of speech, which isn't hard to do, you get a good result. So here is word error rate as a function of SNR. This is what you get with a single microphone, which of course is not so good. With traditional delay and some beamforming, you get the green curve. And then finally, with this optimum calibrated approach, you get the yellow curve. And again, the threshold shift is about 4 dB. I think that can get better. The red curve, of course, is just recognizing the close talking microphone, and we're still not there yet. I mentioned, of course, before on more than one occasion that reverberation is a problem. This approach can be applied to reverberation, but in order to make it effective, what we have to do is split the input into subbands, downsample the subbands, process each of the subbands separately, apply one of those, again, apply that feature, minimize the distortion of the features algorithm, and then combine the output of the subbands. And two results that we have here, again from the thesis, you may recall that the big increase in word error rate was between 300 and 470 of the limited choice of things we had. We do a little bit better at 300 compared to delay and sum, and substantially better at 470. So this is really, in my experience, the only algorithm that I've seen that really shows a significant improvement in reverberant environments. It still isn't very good, but it's better. It's better than 20% improvement, better than 20% decrease in word error rate using the subband processing. Now, what I'm not really telling you, beating over your head about, is that it's a very computationally costly way to go. I wouldn't call it anything like a practical approach, but it suggests ways in which we can look to try to reduce the computation. So in summary, the use of microphone arrays, and these are relatively small arrays with a relatively small number of taps, can improve recognition accuracy where there's spatial separation involved. And I'm going to go back and look at another approach to to microphone array processing in a few minutes. Okay, I'm only going to talk a little bit about physiologically motivated models. And that's only in the context of telling you why I'm doing it. I'm not telling you any more than that because I don't have anything to show for it yet. But I did want to make a couple of statements about it. Once again, here is an example of sound. This is again the...
Welcome to DSP-1.
That was I used that for my first class for half a millennium, it seems. I've taught DSP-1. You've TA'd it, right? Yeah. And this is the MATLAB spectrogram. Now, if we actually take the conventional Mel frequency Kepler coefficients that we actually use as the front end of the system, and then reconstitute spectra with that, you get that. And you can see the frequency warping associated with Mel frequency Kepler. I don't know how many of you looked at that, but if you wonder why speech recognition accuracy is poor, that's probably one reason. It has kind of a blurry, approximation to what you had started out with. In a sense, that's not a fair comparison because one of the reasons why it's blurry is that you're dealing with a very small number of coefficients, and one of the original motivations for using a small number of coefficients is that you wanted to blur up the effects of the pitch pulses, but nevertheless, it still looks terrible. So not only is it kind of fuzzier than the kind of thing that we want, but also there are a lot of things that we know exist in the auditory processing that are not part of what we have here. So detailed timing structure, lateral suppression, enhancement of temporal contrast, just to name three things, and there's a lot more. And there are a lot of other kinds of auditory nonlinearities. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail about this right now, but I believe that appreciation and exploitation of these nonlinearities ultimately will be useful in providing better functionality for speech processing. Again, I want to wait and give you a longer story about this at a time when I have a longer story to tell. But in the meantime, let's take a look at some data. This is from Eric Young and Murray Sachs right here in Baltimore. Looking at physiological representations in two different ways. This is actually one of my favorite papers. This is probably, I'm not trying to embarrass you by putting the dots up on the wall like this. What we're looking at here is this is the Eric and Murray recorded from response of auditory nerve fibers at various different frequencies. The incoming signal was an artificial vowel. This was, I can't even see it. It was an eh. Was it? That's the eh. Yeah, that's the eh. Okay. And so that's what the spectrum is supposed to look like. It was synthesized in a way so that the fundamental frequency was, these things were periodic so that you could do it with a finite number of signals. Now, what the panels represent are different loudness levels, 28 going up at 10 dB up to 78 over in this corner. And the bottom line of the figure is that the contour that you might be able to infer from this changes dramatically as you go from low signal intensities to high signal intensities. So it's what we would say is not very robust encoding of what goes on. Things change with level. Now, again, in a sense, it's a straw. You know, there are reasons why that may be the case, but nevertheless, things do change. Now, this, in contrast, is a measure of what Eric calls average localized synchrony. What's the R? Response? Ratio. Average localized synchrony rate. And I'm not going to define it, but you can see that it has bumps in all the right places where you want to have the bumps. And by the way, it took me a long time with Photoshop to get this in this aspect ratio. The next time you write these things, don't put them in one column, put them in two columns, okay? 18, 38, all the way up to 78. So the take-home message from these curves is that by paying attention to timing, and again, you can read the original paper in JASA to find out how it was done, you have the opportunity of getting a representation that's at the very least preserved over a much wider range of stimulus conditions. Now, the interesting thing to me is that all of our standard feature extraction procedures, anything that's used right now, is something derivative of mean rate. Now, maybe this is a big non sequitur, and that the things that change are consequences of the specifics of the limitations and characteristics of auditory tissue, and with a clean channel, the difference between the mean rate and the timing shouldn't matter so much. But nevertheless, the timing, paying attention to timing information, I believe, at least in principle, gives us an opportunity to get an extraction of information that's quite a bit more robust than what we've seen. So here, for example, is another speech waveform. This is me saying a few vowels. A-E-I-O-U. I started playing keyboard instruments, by the way, because I got kicked out of Glee Club in second grade. Couldn't carry a tune then either. So this is the same thing again, reconstructed from Mel frequency Kepler coefficients. And this is from a reconstruction based on expanding the autocorrelation function, which is kind of a trivial measure that's, that's based on timing information. The formats come out cleaner. Again, it's not a fair comparison because there are a lot more parameters here, but there are no more auditory channels. I use the same number of filters to get this representation that I did the previous one. So if you're willing to put up with more numbers, you can get something that looks cleaner. The downside is that I'm not going to, I haven't gotten these cleaner representations yet to translate to substantially lower error rate, but I'm still working on that quite actively. Okay, so the last topic that I want to talk about, and it's 5:29 now, so I won't spend more than 5 or 7 minutes on this, but if anybody want to sneak out the back door, I won't be offended. The last topic I want to talk about is signal separation based on auditory scene analysis. And again, this is a topic that I'm working on right now. I'm with one exception, I'm not going to show you any recognition results, but I just wanted to share with you how I'm thinking about this and what I think some of the prospects are. Many groups, and once again, especially the Sheffield group, they're always doing everything that I'd like to be doing a year or two before I get to it. The Sheffield group are working to extract cues identified by Al Bregman and his cohorts in McGill to separate and group auditory fragments that are believed to arise from different sources. Bregman called this auditory scene analysis. In fact, that's the title of his book, which many of you may have read. It's pretty fat, but fairly widely distributed. And some of the kinds of cues that are discussed are fundamental frequency and harmonicity. Source localization, interval time delay are two easy physical cues that you can extract pretty decently. Other cues that have been studied include frequency and amplitude modulation, common offset and onset, things like that. So far, I would think it's fair to say that people have generated a bunch of interesting demos. And I haven't seen this translated widely to improve recognition accuracy, but I believe that it will happen. Guy Brown, by the way, is another figure and Dan Ellis have been very actively involved with this, as have their disciples. DeWang Wang in Ohio, Biksha Raj is doing some of this. There's a lot of it going on. Anyway, so here's an example. I'm just throwing out some audio clips of things that we can do. So here, for example, one easy thing to do is you take an utterance, and if you can track the pitch You multiply, if you can figure out what the pitch is somehow, and I'm not going to worry about that for the moment, you multiply the incoming utterance by cosine and a sine at that frequency, then square it, and then you get an estimate, add those together, you get an estimate that's phase independent of the instantaneous amplitude. We all know this from bandpass processing. And then I can resynthesize that signal by multiplying cosines and sines, and I used cosines in this resynthesis, so didn't worry about phase effects, by the amplitude function, and this is what you get. So here's a male speaker.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steels, etc.
And this is reconstructing just with 30 cosine harmonics, with kind of not perfect, but better than real pitch extraction.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steels, etc.
Doesn't sound great, but it could be worse.
Not at this particular case, Tom. Apologized, Whitmore.
This is Brian Langer, by the way, and Stephanie Tomko, if you're curious. And this is the reconstruction.
Not at this particular case, Tom. Apologized, Whitmore.
Obviously, some degradation in intelligibility. I don't know yet how that would affect recognition accuracy. Haven't done it. But you can combine them.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steels, etc.
And then separate them, at least to some degree, by taking the combined signal, multiplying by the, just doing nothing more than taking the signal as it comes in and multiplying it by cosines at the harmonically related frequencies. So if you can track the individual frequencies and then just multiply, this is what you get.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steels, etc.
That was done with non-blind, again, oracle pitch extraction, but blind separation.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steels, etc.
Here's the female speech. Female speech is a lot more degraded. I'm not gonna, and unfortunately that's kind of an endemic problem. The reason being that you have male speech, the fundamental frequency is lower, harmonics are closer together. Female speech, they're farther apart. So you have many more components masking the male. So if we're going to get real successes, that we probably have to do something to cancel more than just take a correlation function. But nevertheless, the information is there.
Human recognition performance is probably also degraded.
I would guess so. And in fact, and of course, then you have classic auditory nerve performance too. The masking is asymmetrical, even at the peripheral level, just because of the nature of the physiology. But I think even assuming a perfect auditory system, there's more physical masking of lower frequency complex signals of higher frequencies than the reverse. So we're stuck with that. This is one real result. This is using that comb filtering method, and also, so this is speech and noise as a function of signal-to-noise ratio. It's white noise, as we know, the easiest kind of noise. And this is just blindly estimating the pitch and then doing the heterodyne analysis and then recognizing. And we get about, not much, 2 or 3 dB improvement, maybe 2 dB probably, if I am honest with myself. Improvement in threshold. We can get another maybe 1.5 to 2 dB if we have perfect pitch extraction. So this is with oracle pitch extraction. The center curve is with real pitch extraction. And again, this was just done up over the summer, not very carefully. We didn't even submit it for anywhere, but it just is a confidence builder, at least for me, that we can take these things and apply them to something where you can show a real result.
Is this accuracy in the y-axis? Because it looks like erroring is worse with higher decibel, I guess it's better.
It must be accuracy. No, the SNR is correct. It's got to be accuracy. Thank you. Interestingly enough, nobody's noticed that before. It's not the first time I've shown it. You get the prize, Sanjeev.
But if you have it at the end of your lecture.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, they get presented tachistoscopically. That's right. Yes. Quick. Okay. Separation by source location. As many of you know, my original work was in binaural hearing, so this is close to my. 2 signals arrive at different azimuths, different ITDs. You can model auditory perception as a bank of bandpass filters followed by cross-correlation of the filter outputs. And this is a block diagram of a system that Tom Sullivan actually did for his PhD thesis eons ago, back when we couldn't really do this kind of work because of computational limitations. And again, from Sullivan's thesis, these are examples of a vowel, signal-to-noise ratio. As signal-to-noise ratio decreases as we work backwards, and what you see is that the shape of the curve changes as we get more and more noise. So this curve here is different from this one down here. Now with 2 inputs with a 120 microsecond delay, with that separation is about 60 degrees off to the side, you get better preservation. And now, if we assume that we have 8 ears instead of 2 ears, which is okay for microphone arrays, we get almost perfect preservation. So, at least in principle, that works well. In practice, you get a moderate size improvement with a lot of computation. But the fact that, again, that it worked at all and better than delay and sum beamforming, and when I say improvement, I mean improvement over delay and sum, caused me to go back and look at it again. So a question that I've been asking more recently is what do things actually look like on the correlation display? So here again are 2 combined signals.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
These are the 2 together.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
And if I separate them with delay and sum beamforming, this is just with a kind of small beamformer, about 7 elements, I get, let's look at the male side first. I'm sorry these aren't quite amplitude normalized properly.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
I'll play that one more time. If I can induce the gods from Redmond to give me my pointer back.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
So you can hear some improvement, but you still hear the female speaker in the background. Here we go. This is with cross-correlation processing, same inputs.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
It's the side signal is a little bit more suppressed than it was before. And finally, I do some additional processing. This is a Stern special that nobody else seems to believe in binaural perception other than me, but it gives you...
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
Now, in this last example, there is greater secondary signal suppression, but certainly at the expense of greater primary signal distortion. And I don't know, which is going to come out ahead, but that's an empirical issue, and we will do the experiment. On the female side, we get this.
Not at this particular case, Tom. Apologize, Whitmore. Not at...
Sorry. Uh-oh. Spinning wheels are...
This particular case, Tom. Apologize, Whitmore.
The wheels spin.
It means it's about to crash. See what I tell you? Yeah. Give me a second. I actually have another version up here.
I should remember this, to have 2 versions running. So when one crashes,
Well, I don't know if you have this problem. For me, the more recent PowerPoint, the 2004, I can't play an audio signal twice without flipping the thing up and down. It really pisses me off. This is not an improvement. So that's why I had the other one up. So let's move on, though. The last thing, this is the very last thing. Promise, I'm going to talk about it. No more bait and switch, right? And it's quick. Separation using micromodulation. Micromodulation in amplitude and frequency is helpful in separating, and could be helpful in separating unvoiced segments of sound sources. And that's particularly important to us because so much of the easy stuff is with voice speech. But what are you going to do for the fricatives or for that matter for people whispering? So I want to give you one of my favorite demonstrations. John Chowning, some of you may know, is one of the honchos at the AI lab and the music lab at the Stanford AI group. He invented the technique of frequency modulation for music sound synthesis and sold it to Yamaha and made a lot of money for Stanford and for Chowning. I had him over at CMU in 1981, and he gave a demonstration like this that I couldn't reconstruct until recently. What I'm going to play is you're going to hear 3 sine waves at 300 hertz, 400 hertz, 500 hertz. Then you're going to hear 10 harmonics on 300 hertz, 10 harmonics on 400 hertz, 10 harmonics on 500 hertz. Now, the way you're going to hear that, because the auditory system, when you have complex signals presented, will generate will give you a perception that's equal to the fundamental frequency that you would have had if those were upper partials, this complex pitch generation. 300, 400, 500 are all multiples of 100 hertz, and you'll hear a signal at 100 hertz. In this section here, you have nominally 30 components, although quite frankly, the 4th component of 300 is very similar to the 3rd component of 400. So it's 30 minus something, but they still are all multiples of 100. So you're going to hear 100 hertz again, a single complex tone that's fused together with a frequency of 100 hertz. It's going to have a much sharper timbre because there are more harmonics. Then I'm going to start to modulate the 300 and then the 400 hertz and the 500 hertz. I'm going to start frequency modulating them separately. And at that point, you're going to hear a chord with 3 sounds. What that indicates to me, well, I'll tell you after I do it. Let me cut this back so you don't quite get so much signal distortion. See, I have to do that in order to do it. So those 3 signals segregate. So what that suggests is when we have multiple speakers tracking, if I can track the fundamental frequencies separately, not an easy problem, then I can use that to isolate it. So that's one of the things that I've been trying to do lately. I have, like everything else, kind of limited success. But here's an example of signal separation that we can achieve just looking at frequency modulation. There's no attempt to estimate fundamental frequency. So I looked at the frequency components of the same 2 signals together. I was only able to get the male, some reasonable approximation to it. I just looked at frequency modulation. I looked at those channels and then I looked at correlations across frequency channels of frequency modulation, and then reconstructed just from the subset of channels that were correlated. So we get here the isolated speech.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc. Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
There's a little bit of a registration problem here, but and then separated by frequency modulation alone, completely blindly. No. What a disappointment.
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
How's that?
Author of The Danger Trail, Philip Steele, etc.
The other signal, the background signal is a little bit longer. That's going to come out after the other one's done. But it was interesting to me that I could get that far just looking at modulation cues alone. I'm particularly interested in amplitude modulation because of its application for that, but that's been harder. Anyway, so all of these are difficult. As Eric Young knows, I've been working hard to do a better job of tracking the frequencies and amplitudes in different bands, and it's not been an easy problem, but I think it will lead to some interesting results. So finally, robust recognition in the 21st century. How's that? We get to have these millennial titles now. Low SNRs, reverberated speech, speech maskers, music maskers, they're all difficult challenges for robust speech recognition. Hopefully you believe me. Robustness algorithms, looks like I'm reading from notes here, and I am, based on classical statistical estimation work are okay for stationary noise and linear filtering, but that's so yesterday. In the presence of transient degradation, multiple speech and speakers and things like that, they're relatively ineffective. Some of the more recent techniques that are effective to varying degrees include missing feature reconstruction, a combination of complementary sources of knowledge, and microphone array processing based on feature optimization. Those are all things that we've done in recent years that we have real numbers for. Some of the other things that I'm trying to do include things like computational advances based on auditory physiology and perception. Again, I'm very interested in that, and hopefully I'd love to come back in a year or two and have good numbers, but not yet. And computational auditory scene analysis also shows promise for signal separation problems, which I think are extremely interesting. But I think it's fair to say as well that the field is presently in its infancy. There's a lot of very fundamental work that remains to be done. But as they say in China, we're living in interesting times, and we should get some good results. So more information about this work can be found at www.cs.cmu/robust. That's our group's website. It's for the last 7 years, I've been promising myself that I'll fix the website up. It looks like it was done 7 years ago. But if you turn to the thing that says papers, you'll have all the papers and theses, and that's where the good stuff is. I think that's it. Yeah, it is. Thank you. Thank you very much. Questions? Zach, if you weren't here, nobody asked you any questions.
Well, I have a general question. In spine evaluation, we saw that using system combination was very effective in getting good reduction in a robust recognition task. And that has translated and has been applied for regular tasks like speech recognition, switchboard or rich transcription, and it gave consistent accuracy improvement. So question is, if we have better models for speech recognition per se, through system combination and other things, would robustness be an issue at all?
Well, I think robustness is always going to be an issue because anything that we can do, at the front end to clean things up is going to make things better later on. I think that human perception is as effective as it is because we have so many different ways of looking at things. And I think the system combination stuff in its best form is a method by which we somehow can get different looks at things, different perspectives on the same thing. And part of the challenge that's only been addressed to a very, very limited extent so far is trying to develop systematic ways of getting looks that are maximally complementary. So there's a lot more work that can be done there. But once again, anything that you can do, so if I have a signal and noise, if I can tease away just the stuff at the harmonic frequency, say with a comb filter or something like that, I've improved the signal-to-noise ratio. If I can apply some kind of spatial filter, using microphone arrays, I've improved the signal-to-noise ratio. And that's just like moving farther up that curve for free. And then we can then apply everything else that we've done in any other fashion. So the right solution has been to apply a combination of techniques. And I've been fortunate to be around a group that's given me the luxury of having multiple students in which I've been able to do more than one thing at once. And I think that's given us a good perspective on things that is broader than just a single technique. Other questions? Comments? Some more food over there. Yes, Jason?
So one thing that I've always been curious about for modeling of non-stationary noise is the extent to which it's wise to try to build sort of real models of different kinds of noise. So background music and other background speech, which are both things that you're talking about.
Well, my own gut feeling is that you're better off not trying to do that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, there are two things that I'm intrinsically skeptical about. One of them are algorithms in which you try to cancel something like a room response. I've kind of gone from deeply skeptical to agnostic, for example, about blind source separation. And that's only because I've seen so many demos of blind source separation that seem to be effective, but I'm still not sure that it'll work on a real problem. I'm looking at that right now. Any time that I've tried to model environments, and we've frequently done this, for example, a lot of the early DARPA tests when you had like 10 different microphones or something, we go out and try to model all 10 of them, and I could model them and then try to do a Bayesian guess about which environment I'm most likely to be in at any given point in time. And that would be fine for the evaluation, but it never was very useful for the real world. The one exception to that was that for a long time in the broadcast news evaluations, I was talking with somebody about that the other day. When the original broadcast news evaluations came out, the first one was '95, there were 4 sites. We came in second to IBM that year. And in those days, everybody was trying to kind of guess which particular condition you had. There were things like straight-up speech and conversational speech, and speech and background music, speech and background noise, telephone speech, and so forth. And the exception was the BBN group. Always was very steadfast in their insistence that if you just have one big set of models and you just do the best job you can, minimizing the error rate for the baseline condition, you'll end up best overall. And as time went by, that view came to prevail, with the possible exception of the telephone bandwidth because of the different signal processing involved. So I think it's better not to try to finesse the problem by trying to guess what's coming up because you're always going to be wrong sooner or later. Rather, you're better trying to build an internal representation that's going to be impervious to anything that might get thrown at it. That's my own personal bias, but not shared by everyone. Eric?
Well, in connection with that, I mean, there's some evidence now that if you present complex environments, where you have foreground signal and background signals and echoes and noise, that neurons in auditory cortex that are interested in, say, the 2 kilohertz band, some of them will respond to the foreground signal, some of them will respond to the echo, some will respond to the background noise. And the evidence is that if it comes from manipulating particular parts of the signal, taking them away, and neurons change their responses in ways that suggest that they're not just responding to the energy, in filters. They're actually trying to do a little bit of what Jason suggested, which is representing different aspects of the scene separately.
Yeah.
regardless of how much energy you're using.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm okay trying to come up with, kind of fundamental constituents of the scene, but to try to have an internal representation of every possible scene, I think that's hopeless. But I could be wrong.
But on the other hand, what you said actually may even suggest what Rich is saying, namely that we want to perform multiple functions with this complex signal. We not only want to hear what the person is saying, we may also be interested in figuring out, for example, if he's in a big reverberating room, because when somebody calls me, nowadays it's getting better, but often I can tell if they're on a speakerphone, and I can tell them, no, get off the speakerphone, I can't hear you. And so we're performing multiple tasks, and for one of the tasks, namely recognition, it's the neurons responding to the foreground signal that are the ones that, in other words, there is a representation which is invariant to what's happening in the background. And all of them, we used to collectively think of them as the neurons that respond to the 2 kilohertz band. But now we are finding out that they're responding to different aspects of the 2 kilohertz band, some to the, and how they do it, of course, is a different question. I don't know the answer to that. But in there is one representation which is invariant to the acoustic condition.
Maybe. I don't know. I don't think the data go that far.
Okay, no, I'm just saying that from what you told me, I could also make it easier.
Why don't we thank this?
All right.